everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I am honoured to be speaking with Professor Brendan Cropley. Brendan, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure and an honour to be invited to be part of this. So thank you.
I'm super excited to be chatting with you, Brendan. I tell you what, to start us off with, why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Okay, Professor Brendan Cropley. I'm a professor in sports coaching at the University of South Wales. My background's in sports psychology. Trained as a BASIS sport and exercise scientist back in 2007, and provided a range of sports psychology services to teams and individuals. But I kind of moved my area of research and my area of practice into sports coaching, and hence why I kind of work in that area of the field at the minute. But certainly I tried to join sports psychology and sports coaching together, and build on the work of Rich Therwell and a number of other people who have considered sports psychologists and sports coaches as performers. So that's really what I do. I try to do a lot of research, a lot of practice, and anything else I can get myself into, because kind of love just working in the field and working with the different people who occupy the field and work in different areas.
You said something there, joining sports psych and sports coaching, which that's my passion, and I'd love to talk about that today. What I do know is that you have a rich background in competing in sports, specifically soccer, football. Would I be right in thinking, were you a scholar at Norwich City Football Club?
Yes, well, sort of, yes. I was offered a scholarship, and I was advised to carry on engaging in my studies. So I think they sort of already were trying to give me the shepherd's crook before I'd started. But no, to be fair, Norwich City looked after its scholars. They tried to make or help those individuals make the right decisions for them. Much of my time there was a very positive one. So I do like to sort of extol the benefits of the coaching staff and the philosophy of the club at that time, because of obviously all of the bad press a lot of the bad press that's come out around academy football in the UK. I thought Norwich were very considerate of individuals' needs, and they tried to make sure that they did the best, as far as I was aware, for those individuals. So yeah, it was a generally positive experience, Dan, I will admit, apart from the fact that playing in goal, I used to chuck that one in, hence why I'm now working in sports psychology and not as a professional football pundit.
Okay, so you were a goalkeeper at Norwich?
I was a goalkeeper, yes, for my sins.
Hugely psychological position. Yes.
If I'm totally honest, but the story that I had was that I was given so many opportunities to really develop and excel at Norwich, but it was probably the psychological elements of the game that really held me back. If I'm totally honest, there are times that I was so happy to be there, but I was just happy to be there, and I probably didn't engage in the sorts of activities that I should have been doing to develop myself. There are times when I was kind of happy to be sat on the bench, because I just didn't want to. I was just too nervous to play. Although when I did tend to play, particularly during my second year, I actually performed really, really well. I had nothing to worry about whatsoever. And as I mentioned, there was a relatively supportive environment. Yes, it was 1996 to 1998. So there was still a lot of sort of old practices within the club, if you like. The coaches weren't backwards in coming forwards when they felt as though you needed to get a little bit of a dressing down. But generally, there was a supportive environment in the club. I don't think that I had the psychological attributes required to succeed. And certainly coming from a small town, although I'd played football all over the world up until that point, I probably wasn't ready socially from that perspective of football to fit into the dressing room banter and that sort of thing either.
That's really interesting. So would you say your interest in sports psychology stemmed from that experience at Norwich City?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, you kind of not being educated in the notion of sports psychology at the time, you kind of knew that something was going on mentally. But whilst I said there was a supportive environment, you still didn't feel as though that was the sort of thing that you should talk to your coaches about because of the connotations associated with talking about psychology. I understand that a lot of these prejudices and a lot of these views still exist, but certainly at that time, I felt as though I could go and talk to my coaches about a range of technical or tactical factors, but certainly I didn't feel as though I could go and talk about the mental side of the game. So it was something that you tried to process internally, and whilst you're dealing with so many different things at that particular time, obviously you're growing up, you're maturing as an individual, you're dealing with the social aspects of your friendship groups are going in one direction, you're trying to be dedicated to the cause. I was still trying to continue, I still was continuing my schooling. So many things going on. So you're trying to deal with all of these things internally. And it wasn't really until I left Norwich and decided to go to university that I started to be able to label some of the experiences that I was having, some of the emotions that I was having, some of the cognitions that I was having. And it really sort of flicked the light switch for me to start to make sense of those things.
When you reflect back, I mean, obviously you talk very positively about your experience in Norwich City, recognise that you weren't good enough mentally, if that's the right way of putting it. And on the one hand, you sort of say, well, the coaches were forward-thinking with a touch of old school, supportive, but at the same time felt like you couldn't necessarily go and have a conversation around the psychological or social components of the game. Would you say, when you reflect back, due to the stigma that is in and around psychology, or do you think that was a knowledge gap from the coaches? Do you think they were just scared to talk about it because of the stigma, or because they just didn't know that much about it?
Yeah, I can't say they were scared of talking about it. I just don't think anybody did talk about it, so we never knew. And maybe the stigma almost came from the players, because you'd sit in the changing rooms and you kind of have these informal conversations, and you'd pick up that players were experiencing similar things, but the conversation seemed to end there. Nobody really followed up those conversations about the mental aspects of performance. They kind of just changed the subject, and as a result, I suppose we probably built up a barrier associated with the stigma that surrounds the psychological aspects of performing, particularly at that point in time. So, on reflection, looking back, if I'd gone to speak to the youth team coaches, I'm sure they would have been quite supportive. Whether they would have been helpful or not, I don't know. But it was just something that wasn't seen to be the thing to be doing at that particular point in time. And I suppose that comes from a lack of education on our behalf. But also at that point in time, there was probably less emphasis on developing those psychological attributes. It was almost kind of taken for granted that you would develop them, or you would demonstrate them during a match day or training, or in and around the club itself.
You haven't got it, and if it is going to be developed, it's going to be developed during activities within sessions, essentially.
Exactly, yeah. And I don't know whether the coaches kind of knew that. I mean, you look at models of developing resilience at the middle. I mean, I know Mustafa Saka and Dave Fletcher talk about challenge and support. There was certainly a lot of challenge, both within the physical nature of the sessions, but also in the discourse that coaches used to describe performance and to feed back to you. Whether there was the support there to really help you through those experiences or not, to develop those resilient behaviours and those resilient beliefs, I'm not too sure.
Yeah, you mentioned Mustafa there, and we spoke to Mustafa on the Sports Psych Show, episode 33, which was an absolutely awesome episode, and the great work he's doing with Dave Fletcher there on resilience. So, professional football didn't quite happen for you, didn't materialise, and you entered into an academic world. And consultancy world. So when you started to do your initial degrees and your master's degree and so on and so forth, and you started to get to know the landscape a little bit better. At that time, and so that would have been around, early part of the millennium, did you feel that there was an obvious shift in attitude towards sports psychology? Did you feel that the integration of sports psychology into coaching practices and processes was starting to happen at that time? Was it an emerging field at that time?
Yes, such a good question. I think that I developed my knowledge and understanding and passion for the field. I almost felt as though people were coming along with me. And as a result, I think I tried to almost instill that passion and that those views on other people. And as a result, I suppose I ended up potentially having a little bit of a view of the way in which other people perceived sports psychology. My first role as a practitioner was within a professional football club academy, and looking back now, I think I was generally brought in so that the club could meet certain requirements from the national governing body. So I'm not going to say a great deal too more, because I don't really want to get myself into trouble, but two, I don't want to be unfair in that they're not here to obviously offer a rebuttal. But it certainly felt like that they were paying lip service to the support. And after a while of kind of making sense of the situation, I started to develop a good rapport with the players that I was working with, because I was able to understand their situation, having been in it previously. Some really interesting things came out of that initial experience, actually. One of the first things was that when I went into the club, I didn't want to gain entry because I'd been a football player. I wanted to gain entry with the players because they felt as though I had something to offer them, or that I could help them with their journeys as young people and as football players. That didn't work out. They did not give me access. They did not open up. They did not give me the time of day until they found out that I had played. As soon as they did, all of a sudden, the sport knowledge that I was trying to demonstrate previously, all of a sudden it became more valuable to them. So it was a really important lesson for me about understanding the context in which I was working. I kind of thought that I knew it, and I took that for granted because I'd spent 4 or 5 years previously, at a professional football club, and I'd also gone out to the States after I finished my degree to try and pick my professional football career up, but that soon went down the So, I kind of thought I knew about the context, and actually I felt as though I became a little bit lazy, or a little bit blind to some of the nuances that would really help me to do something that was quite meaningful with the setting. So that was a really important lesson. And the second one is that I built up a little bit of a resilience as a practitioner, because the coaches would almost be quite divisive within the sessions. So sometimes they would come into the sessions to keep an eye on the boys or to see what was happening, but they would generally sit at the back reading papers, doing stuff that kind of distracted the players. And as I was a young practitioner, I kind of let this happen for quite a while, but it was always something in the back of my mind that I kind of thought was totally detracting from what we were trying to achieve, what the coaches had asked me to try and achieve. And it was taken away from the experience of the players. And so relatively early on in that experience, I tried to have a really honest conversation with the coaching staff. The head of the academy at the time was a very physically quite a large chap. He was quite intimidating, quite robust with the language that he used. So it was it wasn't an intimidating and difficult situation for me. But I kind of thought to myself that, I've either got to have this conversation or I've got to remove myself from the situation, because we're not really having the impact that we should be having. And actually all I'm doing is I am pandering to their needs and probably painting up even a worse picture of sports psychology, or adding to the stigma of sports psychology that was still present at that particular point in time. So I had that conversation, and he was so open to what we talked about, and as a result, from that day forward, everything seemed to get a whole lot better. So a couple of really big lessons for me there, and I suppose we have those experiences personally to really make sense and understand what they mean for us and the way in which we operate. But they were certainly big lessons for me that have really guided my practice since.
Okay, so 2 challenges: the player challenge, the coach challenge, attitudes towards sports psychology from both. That initial one, the player challenge, that cultural landscape of players not necessarily accepting psychologists, psychology, the language of psychology into their environment. Do you think you said about context, do you think it's imperative that a sports psychologist speaks the language of the sports person in front of them? Do you think a young sports psychologist, say, going into soccer, football, should know the specific challenges and know the specific language that the players speak? Or do you think that actually it's incumbent on a psychologist to go, well, hang on a minute, I'm not in this environment every day, and actually I'm from the outside, you've got plenty of advice from people who know about soccer, who know about football, I can be additional here. I see both sides of it, Brendan, but it'd be interesting to get your interpretation on it.
Yeah, certainly. I'd be interested to see, to listen to what your thoughts are around this. But this conversation happens so often with the people that I supervise, and we talk about it all the time. How much of the sport, how much of the language, how much of the culture do you really need to, let's say, be effective within the service that you're offering? And I kind of argue with them. We try to have a critical discussion. I say you can't come back at me with "it depends." I want you to justify a kind of a position, and I go back on that now and kind of say it depends, because what I try and do, before I go and work with an athlete or a team or a coach, I try and learn as much about that sport as I can, and then I make a decision about whether I need to demonstrate that knowledge to the individuals or to the groups that I'm working with, based on what I think their needs are. And I think that set of social skills about the way in which you interact with individuals, again, develop from experience, develop from learning from the things that you've done previously. But it becomes a very delicate matter, because I think, as you were alluding to, I've been in situations where the athlete does not want another coach, and therefore they don't necessarily want you to talk to them in technical terms, tactical terms, cultural language associated with the sport. They kind of want you to be an outsider. So even though you have that knowledge, you kind of almost stage manage the situation. You present yourself in a way that suits that individual. And I think you kind of have to make a decision then about when you might start to utilize some of that language to demonstrate your knowledge or your understanding. And it might come in if you're in specifically with that particular individual, to help them to understand about what it looks like for them in practice and in competition. So I do think it's important to have that level of understanding, but whether you demonstrate that you have that level of understanding or not is probably dependent on the situation. Having said that, I've worked with a netball team for some time now, and I've been trying to learn some of the language and pick up on these things, and I think it's really helped me to develop maybe a closer relationship or a better working alliance with some of the players, because they see it as a two-way street. I'm asking them for information, they're asking me for information, and all of a sudden it becomes the relationship becomes more beneficial, and certainly it allows me to work with those individuals as individuals, but also as a team as well. So yeah, I think it's a tricky one, and I think it is situation dependent. I don't know what your experiences are, but on the sports that you've worked in.
Let me start with what you just said. I think that's really fascinating. And I'm not going to say I'd not considered that before. A relationship builder. So language as a relationship builder, knowledge, specific sporting knowledge as a relationship builder. As you were saying that, it kind of really resonated with me, and it almost felt like a great way to establish some kind of social cohesion between yourself, myself, and the team or you're working with. My attitude has changed over the years. I don't think there is one answer, and I think that when listening to you speak about it, it kind of reinforces that attitude. Context matters, individual preference matters, I think I was probably slightly biased in the early part of my career, in as much as when I was a professional golfer, I would listen to some sports psychologists speak about golf, and I'm probably aghast to say this, but I would listen to some speak about golf, and immediately, because you know the language and what you're trying to do like the back of your hand, it's just part of you. Golf was part of me. I'd done it, well, certainly half of my life in, say, my early 20s, and there was a fragility in terms of accomplishment. I wanted to achieve. I wanted to compete. And so I didn't have time to mess around with anybody. So if somebody came along and spoke my language, a good knowledge, or what I would have perceived to have been a good knowledge of the mental side of the game, then, yeah, bang, you're in there. Great. But if somebody's standing there and saying, well, what's this? And you've got to explain to them what a bunker is. Extreme example, right? but that there's, I think sometimes in sessions, sports psychologists can say something, and I've probably been guilty of this myself, in certain sports, that's so far removed from what you know to be true, or is so far removed from what is relevant, that you can lose them. You can lose the client, or the client, loses you. And so I think there's that. So when I set out, I was like, I'm going to specialise in two sports. I'm going to work across the board, but I want to specialise in two sports. I know golf like the back of my hand, so bang, 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 I'm fine there. And then I got into soccer, and one of the things I said to myself is I've got to go and work at non-league level. I've got to learn the language of the player, and I've got to learn the challenges that players face. Now, obviously, over the last 15 years, Brendan, I've worked in multiple environments where I've not known the language, and that's okay, because over the years you start to experience, okay, well, you bring an explanation to the table, and as I said, you've got plenty of people around you, Mr. and Mrs. baseball player or basketball player or rugby player in front of me. You guys have got plenty of people around you who know that sport like the back of my hand. I don't know your sport, I don't know the language, but I tell you what, I'm passionate about human performance, and it doesn't matter what landscape it's in. Let's negotiate and co-create some great solutions for you or you as a team. So I suppose, I don't know if I'm telling you about my attitude towards it or how I would deal with it, but that's where my mind goes.
Yes, I think what you said there is I think it's absolutely spot on. And I was going to mention the notion of disclosure and just being open and honest, which is again a great way potentially of helping to build initial rapport, but fundamentally, we are interested in human performance. We're interested in human functioning. We're interested in human well-being, or whatever it is that you base your practice on. And that is a common language. Yes, all right, there are nuances based on the context in which you're working and based on what the desired outcomes might be. But they are common languages that can be used to really bring people together in those working relationships to achieve something special. And I think the nuances around sport language, sport culture are vitally important, but potentially less important than understanding those other factors.
You mentioned the word well-being, or words well-being, and I do want to talk about that today, because I think it's a fascinating landscape, especially now, very relevant in sport, and has been for the last few years. I do want to return to the second challenge that you had, that coach piece, that coaching attitude. And when we first started the conversation, you talked about that sports psychology, the relationship between sports psychology and sports coaching. And I often talk about integration versus isolation, the importance of integrating sports psychology into sports coaching. And I've come across so many different attitudes from coaches. Obviously, you recount that first attitude that you had from a coach and a head of academy who was quite dismissive to begin with, and then you confronted that person and managed it, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I've had coaches who have been very much that isolation piece of, you're over there, go and sit in the corner and the players come and see you. And then I've had coaches who are so much about the integration, but the point of view that it all has to be through the coaching staff, which I'm probably as dubious about that as I am about absolute isolation. So, yeah, I mean, where's the landscape for you right now? I know you're working on the cutting edge here. Sports psychology integrated into sports coaching. There's no question there. Just talk to me about it.
Nice. In the situation I mentioned, it was quite interesting because after I'd had the conversation with the coach, I said things started to go a lot better. The coaching staff started coming up to me and asking me about situations and how they could better integrate psychology into their coaching practices. And I kind of thought, I've cracked it. Absolutely cracked it here, because for me, that in order to change individuals' opinions, particularly in football at that point in time, there has to be an integrated approach where coaching staff, those people who are seen to be they are fundamental gatekeepers to those individuals' progression through the different stages of the academy and into the professional phase, into the first team. They have to be seen to be supporting what these support staff are doing, whether that's a sports psychologist, a strength and conditioning coach, or whatever. As soon as they start to undermine that work with their language, their discourse, their values, their opinions of those different professions, the players will start to formulate opinions based on that of their coach, as far as I've experienced. And so for me, that was a real watershed moment. As soon as I got the coaches on board, I knew that the work that I was doing with the players would continue for some time, and that we could really start to change opinions and start to help them to develop the attributes that they needed to not only be able to survive within that quite tough environment of academy football, but also to thrive as individuals and as football players. So for me, that was really important, and it's kind of moved my practice forward since then. A couple of years later, a PhD student got in touch with me who was looking to try and integrate some psychological skills training into coach education, and sent me some of the resources that she was using as part of her research. I thought, this is the way forward. We have to be a little bit careful, but this is definitely the way forward, and it's something that I've looked at within my the coach education side of what I do. We've really looked at the role of the coach within that aspect of performance. So at the Football Association of Wales Trust, we run 5 levels of coaching qualification, and really from level 3, the UEFA B licence, up to the professional licence, place a heavy focus on developing coaches' understanding of what psychology is, the mental aspects of performance, and what their role is in integrating the development of the mental aspects of performance within their coaching practice. And the FAW Trust has been great. They've been so forward-thinking in helping us to develop a fully integrated model, so that coaches are really thinking about, when I put a session on, what are the technical, what are the tactical, what are the physical, and what are the psychological outcomes, and how am I attending to each of those? And for me, that's really important. I still think psychology is probably a territory that needs to be explored further, but we are certainly working very hard to try and break down any barriers that still remain from a coaching point of view, and trying to help not only upskill them to be able to integrate different elements of psychological development into their practice, but also just to really understand what their position is within it. Where does the line lie in terms of what they should be doing, and probably what they shouldn't be doing, and what does it mean to work with a sports psychologist, and how can a sports psychologist help from a culture, the development of a culture point of view, from development of performance point of view, or whatever it may be. So for me, that becomes really important. The coach, for me, has a role to play within this scenario, and it's our job really to try and educate them to be able to do that to the best of their abilities. And then we can obviously support that process and support players and support coaches and support the other support staff.
You mentioned there that you felt that coaches could do an even better job, or continue to improve coaches' knowledge in this area of psychology. What does better look like? I believe you're delivering this stuff, or at least you're involved with the FA of Wales, which I know is an enormously forward-thinking football association, and is producing some great names. You know, Dr. Ian Mitchell and Kerry Bowles and people like that, who are going on and doing great stuff in the industry. What are you doing now that's really good? What are coaches taking away and doing well? And what does better look like?
Yeah. This is going to sound so simple, but we had to start from somewhere. And I think what a lot of the coaches take away from the coach education sessions are, I didn't realise that's what psychology was about. I didn't really realise that we could use it to help performance. We just thought it was something that we needed to help people deal with issues. And on my days, I'm still having these conversations that I seem to be having when I started in 2007 as a trainee. And it never ceases to surprise me year on year where we are. So I kind of think, well, what can coaches do better? What can we do to kind of bridge the gap that still exists? But we're starting to influence and educate a lot of people, and they're taking that information back to their clubs and to their environments and within their own mentoring situations, and helping others to develop, a better appreciation of the psychology of performance and positive approaches to psychology to help players to thrive, or to help individuals to thrive in the different areas of lives. So one of the things that we talk about is simply when you're planning a session, you'll always have a technical or tactical outcome. And you'll probably, or depending on what level they're working at, an elite level of sports scientists will work with them to understand the physical outputs required. Why haven't we got a psychological outcome associated with this session? Why haven't we integrated, some psychological principle, and you've only got to focus on one thing at a time that links directly with the tactical or technical outcome you want to achieve? And again, this is kind of a watershed moment in that coaches almost think that they need to develop the whole psychology of the player in one sitting, in an hour and a half session, rather than really drilling down into one or two different attributes which they can address specifically and help players to understand, one, how they develop that attribute, and two, how they can utilize it to affect their performance in training, and then what that means for them in competition. So it's really, really simple things, but those simple things for me make such a huge difference to practice.
So what I hear you say there is we're still overcoming the definitional challenges of psyche. It comes burdened with the definition of, what psychology is about is helping people with problems. And,
yes.
and then really moving forward, it's continuing to push home that notion of, within your practices, every single activity that you have players engage in, there should be a psychosocial or psychological outcome there. And just returning to this, I completely agree with you. And it's, as you say, it's, oh wow, are we still dealing with this? And I suppose we have to give ourselves a talking to and be patient, don't we? But
yes, definitely.
It is. It's useful. It's just the way it is, and maybe it's psychology's fault. I remember watching Dr. Martin Seligman, the legendary psychologist who coined the term positive psychology back in the early 90s, late 80s, and I think he did a TED talk, and the whole premise behind positive psychology is we've got a problem in as much as we just keep talking about psychology related to problems. Yes. Psychology is there for maladaptive behavior and psychotherapeutic challenges and stuff, and I'm biased and I talk about everything being psychosocially driven, and I suppose I take an extreme view. Everything is psychosocially driven and it's always there. But it's amazing how many people come back at me and say, yeah, I agree with you, Dan, because mental health and well-being is really important. And it's like, yeah, thumbs up to you, but also psychology can help players learn. Learning is a word that's important here. Learning probably has neural underpinnings and performance, mental skills training, that's important as well. We're still banging on the door there, I think.
I totally agree. And I think, it comes back to language. As soon as you start talking about well-being, we're talking about being well. We're talking about functioning. We're talking about thriving within society. We're talking about happiness. We're talking about positive factors that will make a huge difference to the way in which an individual thinks, feels, and behaves in the different areas of their lives. But we do have to be so careful in and around the language that we use with psychology. And yes, we do have a role to play in terms of supporting the development of factors that will help people to deal with maladaptive behaviours, cognitions and emotions. But at the same time, we have a huge role to play in facilitating the psychological development of individuals to potentially prevent issues from occurring, or if they do occur, then players already have the skills that they need, or the attributes that they need to be able to effectively and positively with the demands that they're experiencing. And that's something that we've really tried to do and really tried to push through our coach education. But I certainly with the conversations that I have with people within football and within sport, these seem to be relatively consistent in terms of some of the issues that we are still facing.
Just, I do want to go to that wellbeing piece because I know your work, so we will be talking about that. So we'll be probably doing our definition of psychology, justice or injustice, however you want to perceive it. But again, that second theme there was incorporating psychosocial themes into activities. It was really interesting. The other day I was doing a webinar and one of the coaches asked a question around leadership and fed up because Generation Z, we've got no leaders anymore. And it's just like, well, if we strip it back, I mean, when we strip it back, our under 10s, under 11s, under 12s, very young, I know, but under 14s, under 15s, are they incorporating leadership activities or leadership objectives into their sessions? So we're developing leaders from a very young age. I posed a question to them that the modules that you're doing, the sessions that you're doing for coaches at the Welsh FA, how do you go about helping them incorporate these psychological factors, leadership, teamship, right away through to self-talk, motivational things? How do you help them incorporate these psychological things into their session? What is it that you're actually doing?
We do a number of things. Unfortunately, as with any education, there's never enough time. I always say at the start of my sessions, and I suppose it's a get out of jail free card for me, is that if you go away from here with more questions than you have answers, then I've done my job. But we do a number of different things, and we've kind of drawn on the work of Chris Harwood's obviously done quite a lot of work around 5Cs, but recently published. I don't think they're journal articles. I think they're more professional practice articles on the integration of activities associated with the development of the 5Cs in football coaching. And they provide a really nice framework to help coaches to understand some of the things that they can do. Dr. Kelly's research was focused on life skills, but life skills development through football and the role of the coach in facilitating that life skill development and the transfer of those skills from football to other areas of individual lives. And Kerry's work developed a really nice model that looked at several different intervention strategies that coaches could utilise in order to develop certain life skills, communication, team and leadership particularly. So there are models and frameworks out there that we draw upon, but we tend to use a problem-based learning approach. So we'll engage in a formal education activity, workshop discussion around what we can do with coaching practice to develop one or two of the attributes that at that particular point in time those coaches identify as important for them and their practice. So when we do these things, I try and try to make them as flexible as possible. If I went in all the time and I started to talk about, well, yeah, actually mental toughness is, a really sexy term at the minute, we'll talk about that. Half of the coaches are sitting there thinking, no, it's got nothing to do with my players, I need to, something else. So we do a little, let me take a step back. We do a little work around defining these terms, because one man's mental toughness is another man's grit, is another man's resilience, is another person's hardiness, Yep. So we do some work around deflects first and foremost, and then we engage in problem-based learning. So we set scenarios, and the coaches design sessions for individuals, for teams, for units, and then they deliver those sessions. And during those deliveries, we're able to engage in a process of active feedback, and we're able to really start to unpick their thinking and start to really question the players who take part in those sessions about their experiences of developing or understanding those psychological that have been linked into the coaching sessions themselves. So we try to take everything that we do in the classroom back out onto the field or into the changing rooms or into the boardroom. We look at the different contexts in which these coaches are operating, and give them a flavour for some of the things that they might do. And that's where we're at. Unfortunately, we can't cover everything, but we try to give them a set of ideas, certainly.
It's interesting as you're speaking there, I just reflect on how challenging coaching is, because they've got to build up I suppose, an internal library of tactical side of the game, the technical side, the physical side, and then they've got us coming along going, well, you need to know skills training, or we need to be able to define these things and then incorporate them in. And I suppose you can understand, you can resonate with the notion of walking away from the coaching course, no matter how good it is and no matter how brilliantly you guys deliver this stuff, which you do, and coaches still going, oh, this is so challenging. This is just, there's so many strands to this. There's layers of complexity, and it's very hard.
Yes. Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. And maybe, I don't know. Maybe, are we overcomplicating things? You mentioned Ian Mitchell before. It's a great example. He's an A-licensed coach. He knows football, but he knows performance psychology, and he knows leadership, which is certainly his background. His theoretical background. And he's been able to merge those the different elements of his knowledge, his skills, and his practice. And a lot of the work that he ended up doing as a practitioner was actually on the field with the players, with the coaches, and it's probably the best position to be, because the coach then doesn't necessarily have to worry about the psychological aspects, because you've got someone, just like at the elite end now, that they don't necessarily have to worry about the physical aspects or the physical load that players are being placed under in training, because they have somebody who's probably got a little bit more knowledge than them taking care of that. So, if coaches are unable to create that situation with a practitioner, or are unwilling to create that situation with a practitioner, then for me that they have to shoulder some of the responsibility that performance is more than the technical and tactical aspects, and as a result they have to consider the development of the psychological aspects. So one of the things that we do right at the start of those sessions is I kind of question the coaches as to what are the fundamental factors that influence or differentiate those people who succeed, those people who win, or those people who progress from those people who don't. And by and large, the majority of the characteristics that are identified are psychological characteristics. So then we have a discussion about, well, how long do you dedicate, or how much time do you spend dedicating yourself to the development of those characteristics with your players or with yourself? And inevitably, technical and tactical always come out on top, and psychological characteristics come way down. And we kind of then have a critical discussion around the balance of this and why this is. And the coaches feel less educated about dealing with the psychological elements. I think they feel a little bit scared about dealing with the psychological elements. And I suppose the education that I spoke about previously is simply trying to break some of those barriers down and to help them to understand how to formalise some of the things that they do on a daily basis to help athletes develop the psychological characteristics that will help them to perform and to succeed. So again, I always put a big list of, do you provide positive feedback? Do you do individual feedback with players? Do you use simulation training? Do you use goal setting? Do you use positively framed language? Do you use positively framed questioning? Create problem-solving activities within your sessions? And all of the coaches say, yeah, do all of these things, but they don't necessarily understand the potential impact that those factors are having on the psychological development of their players. So certainly being able to try and label those things and discuss those factors with their players, for me, is again a huge step forward, because it starts to break down barriers between player and coach about what it means to be psychologically prepared for performance.
Really interesting, because as you were speaking, one thing that struck me, a difference in landscape between a sport like golf that obviously has a rich history when it comes to psychology and psychological preparation, and football, soccer, probably other team invasion sports. because they're team sports as compared to an individual sport. In golf, you know, I was a 14, 15-year-old, 16-year-old, and I was reading sports psychology books. I was probably a sad anorak 15, 16-year-old, right, reading these books. But you'd pick up a book by Dr. Bob Rotella. You'd pick up Timothy Galway's In a Game of Golf. And soccer players, footballers, probably, I don't know, basketball players, team invasion sports, they don't do that necessarily. You know, young footballers don't necessarily go on Amazon and go, right, what book can I buy that's going to help me from a psychological perspective? And the reason why I'm saying this, and hey, come back at me if you disagree with that notion, but I just sometimes wonder if, yes, it's incumbent on national governing bodies, organisations to create coaching courses that help coaches deliver on these psychological qualities, put psychosocial first or bring it into the coaching practice. But for me, I want to see more within the footballing landscape, for example, in Great Britain. Hey, come on, kids, let's read a football psychology book or soccer. I might be biased here because I've written 3, right? So I might be going for some commission here. But do you know what I mean? I don't get the same passion for the psychological side from football as I say do golf. And I understand that's cultural and it's because of the way the game is. But I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, certainly. What I will say is I think the situation is changing. I think the landscape is changing, and I think young players in academies, from those people who I talk to who work in academies and some of the players that I talk to who are in academies are far more educated now than they potentially ever have been. And I think that some clubs at least are doing a good job of facilitating that process and ensuring individuals are developing knowledge and skills required for critical problem solving, for surviving in life, thriving in life, developing life skills, also developing an understanding of what performance actually looks like and what they need to do to take personal responsibility to develop those aspects. And so we certainly see that. I don't think it would be remiss of me to say I certainly see a lot of this happening at Swansea City. They spend a lot of time on the education of their players and working with their players across the different elements of performance, but also from a social point of view in terms of how they behave and operate off the pitch and how they live their lives. So clubs are really, I think things are developing. Whether they're developing at the pace we would like, I don't know, but I think typically within the culture of football, those things weren't the same things to be done. Certainly, when I was at Norwich, I wouldn't have popped down the library to pull out Weinberg and Gould's book or whatever to make sense of those things. Because, to be honest, I wouldn't have even thought about it. It wouldn't have even been something that would have crossed my mind. I suppose with the development of social media and obviously the internet and the access that individuals have to a whole host of different resources on the internet now and through the grey literature, I suppose things are developing in that way. As a field, we just have to be careful to make sure that the right information is being delivered to these individuals from those different resources.
Sure. Absolutely well said. Listen, last 10 minutes or so, I'd love to quiz you on the well-being side of sport, because one look at your biography on the University of South Wales site suggests that you're doing a lot of supervision for postgrads in the area. What's the state of play at the moment? I mean, there's been, since the London 2012 games in this country, in Great Britain, and it's seeping through globally, the importance of well-being, especially in developing elite adult sports competitors, athletes. Well-being is an enormously important factor, and obviously there's that tension between being the very best competitor you can be, stretching that tension between stretch and support, if you like. What's the state of play right now?
It's a great question. I don't know where to start, really. I suppose within the media, we see a greater prevalence of individuals who are willing to talk about issues associated with well-being, and probably more specifically mental health.
Yep.
Right from the very top of the game, sport. You won't have to go digging too far on the internet to find cases of coaches, sports science staff, and athletes suffering from mental health issues, potentially as a result of the difficult environment in which they essentially work. They are elite individuals working at the elite end of sport, and that poses a number of very difficult challenges for a lot of individuals. And over a period of time, if those challenges aren't dealt with, we know that it tends to lead to experiences of strain and burnout, and those things are generally associated with ill-being, which will have a huge impact on how an individual is able to function in the different areas of their lives. So we have anecdotal reports talking about this. One of the issues that we've got is the terms mental health and well-being get used interchangeably, and actually they are two very different things. I suppose as a field, for me personally, as a trained or accredited in the way, they have to be very careful about dealing with mental health issues, because I'm not necessarily qualified. Well, I'm not qualified. I don't know whether necessarily comes from that. However, well-being is a slightly different matter. People would tell that well-being will contribute to mental health. Certainly, that's how the World Health Organization fit it. But whether there is a direct causal relationship between experiences of high levels of well-being or ill-being and experiences of mental health, there probably isn't the research out there at the minute that would allow us to make those particular links. I suppose we're also having discussions around the differences between what well-being is and what ill-being is. And you have high levels of well-being and low levels of well-being. Well, semantically, it probably wouldn't make sense, because well-being simply means to be well. So do ill-being and well-being sit on the same continuum? A lot of research would argue that they sit on different continuums. So you might experience ill one aspect of your life and well-being in other aspects, or you might experience certain ill-being outcomes, such as job stress, but also experience high levels of well-being outcomes like life satisfaction. Conceptually, we've got a number of concerns at the minute, or a number of issues that we need to address, but I suppose what we're trying to do at the minute within our research is gain an understanding of the landscape of the prevalence of well-being or ill-being, and certain profiles that fit within those different conceptualizations within. Well, our research is looking within sports coaching and sports science staff specifically, but I know other research that's being conducted is looking at it from a complete point of view as well. So yeah, it's a very hot topic of discussion. And that's a good thing, because I think we're becoming more accepting of the fact that we can talk about these issues and share these issues, and do so without the stigma that was probably associated with issues previously. But I do also think that we need to be relatively careful in terms of the way in which we tread along the lines of intervening and dealing with these particular issues until we're able to fully understand what they potentially are.
I think that's really interesting. I think that I have concerns. Because when you started there, you talked about the press, social media. There's a real wave at the moment related to openness. Especially within football, soccer, the openness of feelings of depression, anything related to, or what's perceived to be related to, mental health. And my concern is a definitional one, as you say, is that it's helping people, clubs, players, organisations understand the difference between well-being or ill-being and mental health, if we can, because I do wonder sometimes if there's a conflation between, say, for example, depression and low mood. I think players can say, well, I experienced depression, when they may have experienced a period of low mood, or may have had a depressive episode, but aren't necessarily depressed. And I think that's important, because these are certainly depression, clinical depression, is very, very serious. And we certainly don't want to, I'm going to probably say the wrong term here, but cheapen clinical depression, or make it something that it's not, or simplify it, when actually it involves a great deal of complexity and complication. So yeah, I have concern. It's not an area that's my expertise. I very much define myself as a performance psychologist, with the capacity to work from a well-being and welfare perspective. And as you've mentioned, mental health is below my competence level, but I'm concerned with some of the definitional issues and some of the thoughts, feelings, and messages that are being broadcast on social media and in newspapers.
Yeah, I totally agree. I couldn't agree anymore. I think the issue is a labelling issue as well. Like you say, I experience negative effects. I'll label it as a clinical issue. My thing about that is that the very strained and limited resources that we have in the country to help people or to support people through those situations end up getting used by people who don't necessarily need them. And the people who experience clinical levels of depression aren't able to access that support. And that for me is a particular concern around the mislabeling of these factors. Just I suppose from a societal point of view, more generally. And again, one of the things we have to be careful is the way in which we use the term well-being, because as soon as we start talking about it, I think people automatically start to think about negative factors associated with it. We're talking about well-being, therefore we must be talking about depression, anxiety, negative effect, burnout, etc. But actually what we're trying to do is talk about some of those positive factors that will really impact an individual's ability to function within the social or professional aspects of their lives. And for me, I suppose you could argue that well-being could be linked directly to performance. It's a great way of looking at performance. Certainly, recent definitions of well-being have kind of argued that well-being is a state of equilibrium between challenge and demand. So it links into Mustafa's and David Fletcher's resilience model, that if you start to experience low levels of challenge and high levels of resource, you'll start to feel bored and you'll experience ill-being as a result of that. If you start to get too much challenge and not enough resource to be able to cope, you'll start to feel anxious, etc. So, the definitions of well-being that are emerging in different fields within the medical profession and within other related fields are kind of arguing that that might be an efficacious way of viewing well-being. But certainly for me, within our research, we want to try and just get an understanding of kind of what's happening out there. We're working on a study at the minute that's cross-sectional and longitudinal in nature, and the research would kind of argue that there are pinch points in support staff and sports coaches' seasons that are likely to increase or decrease well-being profiles. And what this means is that it gives us an idea of the types of support and when the support might be needed for those individuals across the course of their seasons. We've also started to identify some of the factors that might better predict higher well-being profiles, particularly from a work point of view. So some of our findings or some of our initial analysis have indicated that perceptions of reward at work, perceptions over work demands, whether an individual is able to withdraw from work physically and mentally, the relationships that individuals have at work will have a huge impact on well-being outcomes such as job satisfaction, life satisfaction, job stress, life stress, and some of the more clinical issues with anxiety and depression. So we are starting to get a better understanding of what these things look like and what impact they're having, what factors might predict them, but research is still within its infancy. There's a great research team at the University of Portsmouth who are doing a lot of research. I think you pronounce his name Paul Gajinsky. Mm-hmm. If I've got that wrong, I do apologise. He's doing some great work on mental health and mental health literacy. But the well-being aspect of things, we're really starting to sort of catch up with that type of research at the minute?
I think the link between performance and well-being, and again, we're not necessarily defining well-being, I think that link is really, really interesting. I think that something I've been thinking about for the past year or so, when I sit down with an organisation and I talk about the kind of services that I can offer, if you like, and I'll talk about three layers of sports psychology, although I'm seeping into the mental health side, which isn't sports psychology per se, but bear with me here. Above the line, or at the top level, is the performance psychology piece, the mental techniques to help people become mentally skillful. Then underneath that is the well-being and welfare piece, whatever that looks like. Then underneath that is the mental health piece. And so if we think about an organisation, if that organisation is covering those three areas, working towards being the best that they can be in covering those three areas, that's quite a strong place to be in, would be my argument. And I think it's interesting because that link between performance and well-being, if we see performance from a broad perspective, not just, again, coming back to tech physical piece, but a broad perspective of mental techniques, such as self-talk, the capacity to have a flexible narrative in and around your competitive state. Those kind of techniques can surely have a drip feed into welfare and well-being. If I am flexible with my narrative around performance, I can be flexible with my narrative around my personality characteristics, what characteristics help me and what hinder me. I can have a narrative that's flexible in around my life stressors. If I've got sort of performance psychology skills. So I wonder if there is. I'm not trying to research it. it's just a hypothesis. I just think there is, to me, intellectually, there feels like a link there.
Yeah, I'll tell you again. We implicitly make a number of those particular links because they seem very efficacious. I think it's absolutely fine to make those links. Whether we've got the evidence to support some of them, we probably haven't, but certainly what you said there I would agree with. And if you look at the work of Dr. Richard Neal and Dr. Steve Mellew at Cardiff Metropolitan University, Rich particularly has started to look at things that individuals on a daily basis that will have a huge impact on their level of well-being, arguably built on a model of self-determination theory. Yeah. So if we're able to develop autonomy, competence and relatedness, or perceptions of those factors, then the likelihood is that we're going to function well within ourselves, we're going to function well within the different roles that we have to fulfill, and as a result we will experience levels of well-being, and you'll also start to see increases in performance in whatever area that we're talking about, whether it be in coaching, sports coaches, support staff, or athlete performance. And so for me, they are fundamentally and intrinsically tied together. And so it should be something that we certainly consider. And I think if you tap things from a performance psych perspective, yeah, I agree, they're going to have a knock-on effect for the well-being or the perceptions of well-being or the experience of well-being. And likewise, if you focus on what you might classify more as well-being factors, they are likely to have an impact in performance. Because if you think about outcomes associated with well-being, we're talking about happiness. We're talking about an individual being able to live their true values, an individual being able to live their true selves. So they start to feel a sense of self-determination. And if we're able to, if an individual is able to demonstrate those things, it's going to have a huge impact on the way in which they perceive the challenges that they face, the way in which they demonstrate adaptive behavioural challenges, and the way in which they perform within the different areas that they need to. So, yeah, I think they are intrinsically linked. Obviously, as a researcher, I'd argue that we need to identify robustly what those links might look like. But yeah, as a practitioner, there are some intrinsic things there that we can consider, bearing in mind that the evidence base is being generated.
My final question: over the last 8 years, again, I'm going to use sort of 2012 London Olympics and beyond as a period where, certainly in this country, in Great Britain, there's been a lot of controversy around stretching and stressing competitors, elite level competitors, and the relationship with well-being. There's been a lot of controversy, court cases, all kinds of things that are going on with some very high-profile individuals. How, there's a tension between trying to stretch competitors, but stay on the right side of well-being, stay on the right side of the ethical, what could be construed as the ethical boundaries of coaching. Where does that lie for you? What's the most important thing coaches are engaging in that enables them to stretch competitors, stretch athletes, but still stay the right side of the ethical boundaries and help those competitors retain a sense of well-being, whatever that looks like?
Yes. I think we have to... The work of Chris Wagstaff on organisational psychology has been hugely important in helping us to understand how organisations might contribute to positive experiences of well-being or negative experiences of well-being within employees or athletes, coaches, etc. So I think that's always a good starting point in terms of really understanding where that line might sit in terms of stretch and support. In terms of what coaches are actually doing, at the elite end of sport, everybody is trying to gain a millisecond of a difference or an improvement in order to achieve an ultimate outcome. To get there, it requires an individual to put their minds and their bodies in positions that they never thought that they actually could. This is essentially what we do as sports scientists. Yeah. And as a result of that, there will be considerable stretch, but it doesn't have to come at the expense of maintaining or understanding or addressing an individual's well-being. Well-being might be different across different contexts in which individuals perform. So an athlete might have high levels of well-being outside of sport, low levels of well-being inside of sport, and vice versa. I suppose one of the key things that we need to take into account, and again, this is one of the most difficult things that a coach has to do, but it's so important, is differentiation. Is understanding individual needs. Individual needs is probably one of the underpinning foundations of what we do as sports psychologists, understanding, constructing really detailed needs analysis, making sense of the problem, making sense of the situation, understanding the individual, understanding the context, understanding their backgrounds. This becomes so important. It's very difficult to do, particularly when you're in a team sport and you've got a lot of athletes that, or a lot of individuals that you need to work with. But for me, that becomes fundamental. And just in my slip there, it's reminded me of one other thing is just to remember that these people are people. That we label them as athletes all the time. And sometimes I'll hear myself if I'm talking in a lecture or whatever, and I keep referring to an athlete. It makes me cringe a little because it is the discourse that we've been brought up with in our profession. There's nothing wrong with it necessarily. But I quite like unpicking language, and I think it kind of paints an inappropriate picture. But these are individuals; they are people. And if you look at probably some success or the more successful coaches, particularly in football at the minute, and I don't mean any disrespect to anybody that I might not mention here, but I'm going to just choose one in particularly. If you look at the way in which Jurgen Klopp has altered the way in which Liverpool operates from the ground up, not only from the end point of the 11 players who take the pitch, but also from the way in which the support staff are treated, the way in which they engage in their work, it's fundamentally, whether he meant it to be like this or not, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but it's fundamentally about improving their well-being, which will improve their ability to work effectively. I speak to a couple of the staff who work with the first team there, and this seems to be the approach that's been taken. So reducing all of the stuff that doesn't need to be done, all of the typical stuff that we might do within an elite sporting organisation that has no real impact, about identifying those things that will really make the big differences and putting all of our energy and effort into those factors and removing all stuff that isn't really going to give us any bang for our buck. And as a result of that, individuals are able to manage workload, they're able to manage the way in which they perceive the demands that they're experiencing. And as a direct result, they're able to put all of their effort into those activities that will stretch them enough to increase their performance. And whether I've answered your question there or just rambled on for the last 5 minutes, I'm not too sure, but I think there are some key things there. Differentiation, treat each individual as a human being, and just place all of your efforts into those things that need to be done, and remove all of the stuff that doesn't need to be done, that will really remove from our ability to be stretched and to perform and to maintain.
No, absolutely. Fantastic. Brendan, thank you so much for your time. Awesome. How can people find you? How can they find you on social media? What's the best way to get in contact if you want to be contacted? How can people find you, follow you, get in contact?
I do try and be active on social media. I think my Twitter handle is @Brendan Cropley. My Instagram handle is the same. Obviously, my email address is on my webpage that's associated with the university. So please, if you want to chat about anything that we discussed today, or you're interested in conducting research or anything associated with psychology, I'm more than happy to chat. So yeah, please get in touch.
Brendan, thank you so much for your time, mate. That was really, really interesting.
No, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Well, everyone, that was Professor Brendan Cropley. Wasn't that brilliant? And I hope you enjoyed that podcast. I'd love to hear what you think of the Sports Psych Show. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of it. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.